I think for those who are listening, so many of us were not involved in sort of the conversation of this at all because what was fed to us was it's complicated.
Yeah.
And so to for our listeners, one thing I want to do right now in this space as well and during this time is take the opportunity to make it a little less complicated. And so to start with it, I think what that starts with is education and people, because one thing that I love about watching this film is what's really, really clear is that this is a very clear example of once you know, you can't unknow.
Yeah.
Once you see, you can't unsee. So can you, for the listeners, tell us what is the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? Because right now in the United States, we're seeing legislation being brought up across, even here in Georgia, where they're trying to conflate anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Can you explain for folks the difference?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, Zionism is a political movement that was created in the mid 1800s. And it was basically, there was this problem that Jewish people had in Europe where we began to realize that Europe was not going to be a safe place to survive for Jewish people. And the Holocaust obviously proved that very right. And so people began thinking about, because of violent anti Semitism, hatred towards Jewish people in Europe, we have to figure out something needs to change. We need to figure out some way to be safe. And so there's a variety of ideas about how to create Jewish safety. Most people actually just came to the U.S. The great majority of Jews, for most of the time, most of the first, actually, yeah. So from like the beginnings of Zionism until the 1920s or so, almost all Jews who realized they needed to get out of Europe came to the U.S. In the 1920s, the U.S. basically closed their doors to Jewish immigration because of a series of racist immigration laws. And so people began realizing that, how do we create Jewish safety if we can't basically get to the U.S. or Canada? And one of those ideas was Zionism. The idea that, and this was kind of around the time when nationalism was kind of becoming, a mainstream political idea, the idea that there's peoples and that those people should have their own country. Right. And there's many flaws with nationalism. There's many flaws with the idea of nationalism. But, if you think of it that way, it kind of makes sense initially. Right. The problem, and so many Jewish people began seeing, okay, the only way we're going to be safe is if we create our own country. But the tragedy is that, we Jews are a diasporic people. We are scattered across the world. And that's not our fault. We didn't cause that. The Romans,
Listen, as black people, I understand,
exactly,
honey. We are a
exactly.
diaspora as well. Yeah. So go, yeah,
Exactly.
continue.
Exactly. And so if we wanted to create our own country, it was essentially going to have to be where other people lived,
Mm,
right?
mm-hmm.
And and the Zionist movement, some people, the basis was, Jews need to create their own state, and it became very clear pretty quickly that most people wanted that state to be in the land of Palestine. And the reasons for that were religious reasons. Our religion's based there. And again, we did live there. Whether we originated there or lived there is a complex question. Indigeneity is a complex question. But we did live there, but we were scattered by the Romans. And other people have lived there for the past 2,000 years. And there's always been other people in that land. Even if you take the Bible literally, which I don't, even the Bible says there was other people who lived there. We were not
Mm-hmm.
the only people who lived there. But the most important thing is that we had not lived there primarily for the past 2,000 years. There's always been some Jews there, but we were a very small proportion of the population. And so all of a sudden, these European Jews, because they wanted safety, decided that they were going to create their own state, but in that land. And if they were going to do that, they were basically going to have to make those indigenous people who lived there either second class citizens or expel them. And that's essentially what happened. Both those things happened, is that the Zionist movement began, again, moving people to that land with the idea not of living amongst those people, but taking it over for their own state. And so that's Zionism. And again, Zionism, it was one idea, one kind of solution to the problem of how do you create Jewish safety. But there's always been deep critiques of Zionism. Zionism, from my perspective, is a flawed ideology. Again,
I
there's
mean,
fair
to me,
critiques of it.
it's basically colonization.
Yes.
For me, like when I'm thinking about the Native Americans, I'm thinking about, in the United States, how the Native Americans pretty much lost out in the fight because they didn't have a concept of land ownership. Not even a concept of it because it was like we have a relationship to the land, and it's we give to the land and the land gives back to us and those sort of things.